Please join me tonight in welcoming Marta Weiss.
It's always tricky, on or off. I think they're off so I can see close, but now I can't see you. Thank you for being here, whoever you are. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kristen. And I'm thrilled to be here for the opening of Arresting Beauty here at the Milwaukee Art Museum. As Kristen said, the exhibition is drawn almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely from the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, in London. And it was originally organized by my colleague, Lisa Springer, who was our curator of touring photography exhibitions with input from me. But this iteration has been in the works for some time. And this version started when I proposed it to Liz Siegel right around the time that she joined the Milwaukee Art Museum as chief curator. So Liz, who's here somewhere, I see movement. So, Liz, thank you. Thank you very much for embracing the idea, and to your whole team for installing it so beautifully. And congratulations especially to Kristen Gaylord, the Hertzfeld Curator of Photography, for adapting the show for audiences here in Milwaukee and bringing works from this museum's collection into dialogue with Cameron so effectively. It was such a pleasant surprise for me to see how that was all going to work on the walls, and it looks gorgeous, I think, as everybody here has probably seen already. So, and thank you very much for inviting me here and having me to speak today. So, Cameron, as you've already been told a few times, was one of the most innovative photographers of the 19th century and one of the most influential photographers of all time. And today I'm going to present Cameron through the lens, pun intended, of Annals of My Glass House, which was her incomplete autobiography. It was never published in her lifetime, but only survives as a 21-page manuscript, which is now in the collection of the V&A. And you can see some pages of it in the exhibition. And I'm showing here the first page on the right. And on the left, you see a portrait of Cameron taken by her son, Henry Herschel Hay Cameron. Annals of My Glass House was only published for the first time in 1889, 10 years after Cameron died. But since it's become a renowned primary source for historians of photography, and as anybody who writes about Cameron knows, it's a wonderful source of quotations. So the title of this current exhibition, Arresting Beauty, comes from a quote from Annals. And I'm showing the page on which she's written, I think it's actually the top, yeah, it's the top line there. I long to arrest all beauty that came before me, and at length the longing has been satisfied. So the title of my talk, Mrs. Cameron's Photography Travels to America, is also a quote from Annals, but I'll get to that later. So Annals of My Glass House is part memoir of the first decade or so of Cameron's photographic career, and part manifesto for her distinctive vision of photography. It's peppered with literary quotations, humorous stories, and celebrity name dropping. And it's all delivered in a tone that alternates between self-deprecating and boastful. She claims that it's a truthful account, but that can't be taken too literally. So on this page, in fact, she continues, I began with no knowledge of the art. I did not know where to place, yes, I'm reading right thing. I did not know where to place my dark box, how to focus my sitter, and my first picture I effaced to my consternation by rubbing my hand over the filmy side of the glass. However, so this is just one example of how Cameron's text cannot entirely be taken at face value. Although she presents herself as a total beginner, there's extensive evidence that Cameron was at least posing and probably printing photographs before she owned a camera. And she may have even been taking them, we don't know. And this would make sense that because photography at that time was really a very arduous process. It involved coating a large plate of glass with photosensitive chemicals and exposing it in the camera while it was still wet. And the camera itself, of course, is a large, bulky wooden box on a tripod that you would need assistance moving. So when we read in Annals of My Glass House that Cameron received her first camera as a gift from her daughter in 1863, famously accompanied by the words, "It may amuse you, mother, to try to photograph during your solitude at Freshwater." This was not a casual gift to a photographic novice. It's not like giving somebody a camera at Christmas now. So even, this is just one example of many of the kind of inaccuracies in the text. But even if it's not always accurate, it provides really fascinating insight into Cameron's photography, her character, her social milieu, and the artistic frames of reference. And it offers really valuable insights through which to view her work. When encountered in the original manuscript, as you can see here, you can see her large kind of forward slanting script and minimal punctuation. And these amplify, I think, the idiosyncrasies of her voice. And I should mention, there's a link to it actually in the exhibition, but on the V&A's website, we have the entire manuscript is scanned, and each page, and I discovered today it's best viewed on a computer as opposed to on your phone. Each page is shown with a transcription because sometimes her handwriting and lack of punctuation can be a little bit difficult to decipher. But in any case, I feel like it gives you this sense of her personality, of this kind of breathlessness with which and energy with which she tells her story. So before I delve more deeply into the text and what we can learn from it, I'm just going to very briefly outline her life and career, and going back to the portrait of her so you can look at her while I talk about her. So she was born in Calcutta in 1815 as Julia Margaret Cameron. Her father worked for the East India Company, and later her husband was also involved in colonial administration. He was 20 years older than her, and when he retired in 1848, the family moved to England. And I always want to say they moved back to England, but in fact, she had never lived in England because she'd been born in India and was educated primarily in France with her grandmother. In any case, they moved to England where they joined several of her sisters who were already established there. Cameron was one of 7 Paddle sisters. And her sisters were already in England, moving in artistic, literary, and aristocratic circles. So that sort of sets the scene a little bit for the social milieu that Cameron was joining. At that time, she already had 4 children, and she had 2 more in England. And the family eventually settled in Freshwater on the Isle of Wight, which is off the south coast of England. And at that time, at that time, the Isle of Wight was a fashionable place that attracted a lot of artists, intellectuals. Queen Victoria had a big home there. And the next door neighbors of the Camerons was Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate, and at that time, probably the most famous writer in the world. And they were very good friends. And so, in fact, that's part of why Cameron herself decided to move there. So it was in Freshwater that she took up photography eventually at the age of 48. And the Camerons, the couple, spent their final years in Ceylon. Actually, a couple of their sons were already living there, which is now Sri Lanka, where the family owned coffee and rubber plantations. So Cameron died there in 1879, and she wrote Annals of My Glass House shortly before leaving for Ceylon in 1875. So we've talked a little bit about how innovative she was, what was so special about her. One thing is that her photographs were rule-breaking. She pioneered the close-up, And she also took photographs, crucially, she took photographs purposely out of focus because she found them more beautiful that way. And she aimed to use photography as a medium of artistic expression rather than a more literal means of documentation. And in doing this, she looked to other art forms for inspiration, especially painting, ranging from the religious imagery of the Italian Renaissance, but also to poetry of her Victorian contemporaries. So she didn't just reject conventions of focus, but also technical, just more generally technical precision. And the example I'm showing here on the left is one of the more extreme examples of how you can see that not only is it soft-focus, but she's left a lot of the imperfections, or she's accepted a lot of imperfections in the print. You see these kind of swirls and smudges that come from an imprecise application of photographic chemicals on the plate. And this is precisely the sort of flaw that other photographers would have rejected, but Cameron sometimes embraced. I would argue that maybe in this example, she even, that kind of liquid sort of inaccuracy or sort of fluidity gives it a kind of dreamy quality that enhances the image. But it's precisely that, but we know that this image, for example, she made multiple prints of it. So we know that it wasn't just a kind of sketch, but she actually found it successful and didn't mind those flaws, whether she didn't mind them or kind of embraced them. In any case, she also, so in addition to these kind of technical aspects of her work, she also embraced the imaginative possibilities of photography, ignoring doubts that many people had at the time. Many people had at the time about whether the seemingly truthful medium of photography could be used to portray fictional characters. And on the right, you see Vivian and Merlin from the Arthurian legend as described in the poems of Alfred Tennyson. So she based her illustrative images on a range of sources depicting characters, as we see here, from poems, but also scenes from the Bible, classical mythology, plays, and other literature from Shakespeare, Milton, and above all, her very good friend Tennyson. So Cameron was controversial in her own time and is world-renowned today. And as Kristen rightly pointed out, in between, she's never faded from consciousness. And for much of the 20th century, though, she was celebrated as a pioneering portraitist, so more for photographs like these, starting with a monograph that was edited by her great niece, Virginia Woolf, which was published in 1926. And so for much of the 20th century, these kinds of staged photographs were dismissed as kind of examples of Victorian bad taste, even though these sort of bolder portraits were seen as innovative and kind of could appeal to modernist tastes. These were a little bit too much for much of the 20th century. But I think that since they really were a significant part of her output, however, and since the 1980s, I'd say, this type of work has been reassessed, and I think now we can quite rightly exhibit, publish, and understand these types of staged, constructed photographs alongside the portrait work. In any case, in her own time, she was harshly criticized by her photographic contemporaries who attacked this apparent mishandling of the medium. At the same time as that, though, she had a lot of admirers in her own time from her literary and artistic milieu. And so these admirers included Henry Cole, who was the founding director of the South Kensington Museum, which later became the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I'm showing here a photograph that we're very lucky has survived. This is a photograph of the very first exhibition of photography we think ever held in a museum. Certainly the earliest photograph of a photography exhibition known. And so this is an exhibition of the Photographic Society of London, but it was held in the South Kensington Museum in 1858. And I'm showing this just as an indication of how early Henry Cole was in understanding photography's capacity in many realms. But in particular, he was an early supporter of Julia Margaret Cameron. And so in 1865, under his initiative, the museum was the only museum to collect her photographs in depth at the time. And then they exhibited them as well. And then in 1868, Cole actually allowed Cameron to use rooms in the museum as a studio temporarily. So we sometimes like to refer to her as our first artist in residence. So by the year 2000, the V&A's collection of Cameron photographs had grown to 252, thanks primarily, since that initial purchase, to donations from friends of Cameron's and descendants. And in 2015, which was Cameron's bicentenary year, as Kristen mentioned, I organized an exhibition based entirely on what was then the V&A's collection, looking in particular at that history. In 2017, so 2 years after that exhibition, this already significant holding of Cameron's work nearly quadrupled because the museum acquired the Royal Photographic Society's collection, the RPS. So in fact, actually, it's this society later became the London Photographic Society, later became the Royal Photographic Society, and that collection, which had been sold to the nation in 2002, was transferred to the V&A in 2017. And it, among its many, many treasures, contained a huge number of prints by Julia Margaret Cameron. And it also contains, so we now have, well, we were just discussing this right before the lecture, 991 photographs by Cameron. So we're just 9 shy of making it to a 4-digit number, which I think would be really impressive. So it's true, I could just go around saying we have nearly 1,000, but I guess I want to emphasize the fact that we're looking for that final 9, please. So in any case, in addition to those photographs, the collection contains these 2 really important archival treasures, the manuscript that I've been talking about and her only surviving camera lens. So, and I guess because the manuscript now is in the V&A's collection, that's part of what prompted me to really explore it in depth and see what new things we can learn from it by really reading it carefully and looking at it together with her photographs. Because as I said, it gets quoted all the time, but I've spent some time really trying to look at it as a whole text and to see what new things might be gleaned from it. So in Annals of My Glass House, Cameron makes reference to over a dozen specific works. And so this is part of the work I was doing to try and analyze the text, was to track down each photograph that she actually mentions by name. And it forms a kind of greatest hits list, according to the artist herself. And most of these are in the exhibition, and I'll be highlighting some of them as I go through the talk. But seen together, you can see these photographs show at a glance the scope of Cameron's output during her brief but intense photographic career. So after receiving her first camera in late 1863 until 1875, when she moved to Ceylon, she produced thousands of photographs. She exhibited them internationally and published 2 books. And then once they moved to Ceylon, she continued to make portraits, but at a much reduced rate. And we're very lucky that the collection includes some of these very very rare prints made in Ceylon, because comparatively she made so few photographs there compared to the rest of her career. You're going to get really tired of seeing this page. Sorry. I'm going to show you more pictures soon. But the fact that the strength of the V&A's collection today in the 21st century is due to the RPS collection would have astonished Cameron, because in her own time, it was the Photographic Society of London, which became the RPS, that published some of the harshest critiques of her work in their periodical, the Photographic Journal. And this criticism often included, was often very sexist, but often included these sort of empty gestures of gallantry, which kind of draw even more attention to her sex and reinforce the male author's sense of superiority. So I'm going to quote from one of these. They say, "Of Mrs. Cameron, we're sorry to say we have very little hope. We're sorry to speak in condemnation of a lady's work, but these photographs have been put prominently forward, and we should be doing an injustice to photography to let them pass as examples of good art or perfect photography." And Cameron even singled out the Photographic Journal in Annals of My Glass House, noting in particular this contrast that they're even making in that quote I just read between sort of non-photographic and photographic circles, and who liked her work and who didn't. So she wrote in Annals of My Glass House, "The Photographic Society of London in their journal would have dispirited me very much had I not valued that criticism at its worth. It was unsparing and too manifestly unjust for me to attend to it. The more lenient and discerning judges gave me large space upon their walls, which seemed to invite the irony and spleen of the printed notice." And of course, the South Kensington Museum is one of these places. We don't really know how large a space on the walls she was given, but we do know her work was exhibited there. So although the Society was slow to acknowledge the value of Cameron's output at the time, in 1927, the RPS staged an exhibition of 121 of her works, the largest retrospective since her lifetime, at their premises in Russell Square, London. And on this occasion, the Photographic Journal lauded Cameron as the creator of what they called masterpieces of photography. And they actually published Annals of My Glass House in its entirety in their journal. And in his introduction, the RPS curator, J. Dudley Johnston, expressed his hope that the journal would, quote, "make some amends for the unkind things it said about Mrs. Cameron in 1864, when the jurors of the exhibition wrote that, quote, she should not let herself be misled by the indiscriminating praise bestowed on her by the non-photographic press, and she would do much better had she learnt the proper use of her apparatus." And I should just mention here too, I'm quoting a lot because of the RPS story of this criticism, which generally was about these kind of technical matters. But some of the people who did, there were reviews written in more general publications such as the Athenaeum that did praise her work. And the thing that non-photography specialists loved about her work was its fuzziness, actually. People found it poetic. They loved that it wasn't so sharp and as kind of literal as the photographs they were used to seeing, but that it left things to the imagination. And also, many people perceived very quickly the similarities between the images that she was trying to imitate and the photographs that she was producing, and many people did respond to it and feel that, finally we can see photographs that do look a bit more like art than many of the photographs they were looking at the time. The lens is a crucial object that, in terms of how she writes about it in Annals of My Glass House, where family in general plays a very prominent role. So it begins with Cameron's account of receiving her first camera as a gift from her daughter Julia. And this was her eldest child and her only daughter. And Julia had actually died in childbirth the year before she wrote Annals. So she had received the camera from her in 1863, but then Julia died in 1874, the year before Cameron wrote her autobiography. And although Cameron pledges to avoid what she calls details strictly personal and touching the affections, the poignant association between her late daughter and photography is very evident. And she writes that it is with effort that I restrain the overflow of my heart and simply state that my first lens was given to me by my cherished departed daughter and her husband with the words, "It may amuse you, mother, to try to photograph during your solitude at Freshwater." The gift from those I loved so tenderly added more and more impulse to my deeply seated love of the beautiful. And from the first moment, I handled my lens with a tender ardor, and it has become to me as a living thing, with voice and memory and creative vigor. So we see here how Cameron associates photography with absence, first as a gift that would keep her occupied while her husband was in Ceylon, and then later it serves as a reminder of her deceased daughter. And she quickly transfers this maternal love and tenderness onto the lens itself, which personifies the apparatus that her critics were accusing her of being unable to handle. So rather than striving for the technical mastery of the camera that the photographic press promoted, Cameron describes this emotional connection with her lens, imagining it as a living thing with an agency of her own. And then she further elaborates on her relationship with the lens, and specifically her refusal to focus it sharply, when she credits her youngest son, the one who took the photograph we saw at the beginning, for noticing that she had arrived at the technique spontaneously. This is another one of these things where I think we have to take it with a grain of salt. But she says, "I believe that what my youngest son, Henry Herschel, who's now himself a very remarkable photographer, told me is quite true, that my first success in my out-of-focus pictures were a fluke. That is to say, that when focusing and coming to something which, to my eye, was very beautiful, I stopped there instead of screwing on the lens to the more definite focus, which all other photographers insist upon." So beauty is not just what Cameron aimed to create in her photographs, but as we've already seen, it's the very thing that motivated her to take up photography. As she said, she longed to arrest all beauty that came before me. She then went on to praise the beauty of the people of the Isle of Wight, and her tone reflecting, I think quite clearly, her privileged position as an upper-class woman who views the surrounding rural community as a kind of source of available models. She writes, "The peasantry of our land is very handsome. From the men, the women, the maidens, and the children, I've had lovely subjects, as all the patrons of my photography know." So, I'm showing here now the photograph that she referred to as her first success, of a local girl, or a girl who was visiting, actually, the Isle of Wight, called Annie. And she goes into quite a lot of detail about how she felt when she made this very first photograph of Annie. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, but she ends it with, "Sweet, sunny-haired little Annie, no later prize has effaced the memory of this joy. And now this same Annie is 18. How much I long to meet her and try my master hand upon her." So she's reflecting on how she herself has changed as a photographer, but also that powerful quality that photography has of arresting, whether it's beauty or anything else, whatever comes in front of the lens, and making us reflect on the passage of time. The many references in Annals to individual models, friends, family members, and admired intellectual figures confirm the centrality of family and also sociability to Cameron's photographic practice. Interpersonal relationships are fitting concern for her, for an artist who never took a photograph without a person in it. So despite the natural beauty that was on her doorstep in freshwater, the only beauty that she longed to arrest was human. And even as a novice, she never turned her camera towards the seascapes that she could have seen from her home, or even tried an easier subject, such as arranging some objects into a still life. She started right from the beginning. It was always about photographing people. These are some examples of plants and flowers that make occasional appearances in her photographs, the closest, we might say, to she ever comes to making a still life, which is pretty far from a still life. But the flowers here just serve as props or backgrounds, and they often contribute a particular meaning, such as here the lily symbolizing purity in this depiction of the Annunciation, or surrounding Pomona, who's the Roman goddess of orchards. And here are a couple of more examples of when she's using, seemingly actually leaving her studio to photograph in situ, although the photograph on the left, I'm not entirely sure, is made outside. It might have actually, she might have brought all these flowers into her studio, because there's a bit of, I don't know if you can see that, but there's a bit of something up there that looks like it could be a wall, but it's hard to tell. And then in this one, this is one I would say is closest she ever came to making a landscape photograph, because this is by far the most kind of depth you can actually see in a photograph by Cameron, because you can see beyond this archway in a garden into the meadow beyond, and there's even a horizon in it, which is it's the only example of this, I think, in all of her work. In any case, the point is that she was interested above all in photographing people, whether for their physical beauty, intellectual capacity, or as reenactors of literary characters. This expression, though, beauty that came before me, refers not just to the beauty that Cameron encountered in people around her and was compelled to photograph, but also the beauty that she identified in the artists that had preceded her. And here I'm showing an example of a photograph that so clearly is inspired by Rembrandt. She describes this as one of the first photographs she exhibited in 1864, where she says that the light was illuminating the countenance in a way that cannot be described. In that same passage, she also refers to a Raphaelesque Madonna called La Madonna Aspettante. And these photographs, she says, modest as always, still exist, and I think they cannot be surpassed. The influence of old masters is most apparent in Cameron's initial years as a photographer. So I'm showing here another work directly inspired by Raphael. So on the left, we see her Saint Cecilia after the manner of Raphael. That's part of the title, that she's being very explicit about her source there. And on the right, I'm showing an 1860s photograph of the painting that she was working from, to sort of show the type of image that she might have seen to inspire her. And here's another example, a Sibyl after the manner of Michelangelo, which is in the exhibition, next to a print, which is, of course, after one of the Sistine ceiling frescoes of this Sibyl. So Cameron, in Annals of My Glass House, defines her particular approach to photography positively. She talks about the quest for beauty, her tender handling of the lens, and the purposefulness of her out-of-focus pictures. But she also describes it in opposition to more prevalent standards that she, as she puts it, all other photographers insist on. And she writes disparagingly of a prize-winning portrait entitled Brenda by Henry Peach Robinson, another prominent photographer of the time. And she attributes the success at the competition to the sharply rendered details of the studio sitting and the sitter's dress. And she herself, Cameron, won honorable mention at the same exhibition, but she's so sure of the superiority of her vision that she says that she's content to have been ranked lower by these judges who seem to only value technical achievements. So whether respecting her lens as a living thing or rejecting these conventional focus, she was deliberately evading these mechanical qualities of the camera to create photographs that she aimed to be more beautiful and poetic. When she described this photograph, which was her favorite portrait of Tennyson, she used another leading photographer at the time, Mayall, as a kind of foil to her approach to photography. So of this one, she says, I took another immortal head, that of Alfred Tennyson, and the result was that profile portrait which he himself designates as the dirty monk. It's a fit representation of Isaiah or of Jeremiah. And Henry Taylor, another friend, a close friend of hers and writer, said the picture was as fine as Alfred Tennyson's finest poem. You're getting a sense of her when I said before that it's full of name dropping, and this is obviously one of the more boastful sounding passages, but there is the sense of self-deprecation elsewhere, such as when she talks about, like, oh, I just discovered how to make things out of focus by accident. Here, by comparing her depiction of Tennyson with that of a prophet, and here she might be thinking of Michelangelo's, another one of the Sistine Chapel frescoes in which Isaiah holds a large book. She clearly is aligning herself with religion, poetry, and art. And then she further quotes what Tennyson has to say about. He has since said that he likes it better than any photograph that's been taken of him, except for one by Mayall, and that speaks for itself. The comparison seems too comical. And here I'm showing an example of Mayall, of one of several portraits that Mayall made of Tennyson. And he was actually, Mayall was a very successful commercial photographer. He had several studios, and he was known for photographing the royal family and eminent men. And he sold these as carte de visite. And so, of course, we can't see what the scale is here, but a carte de visite is a calling card size photograph. And if you've seen the exhibition, you've seen that Cameron's photographs are at a much larger scale. So carte de visite were the most popular form of photograph of the time. People collected them, gave them away, traded them, and displayed them in albums in their homes. For Cameron, she finds it just, like this represents everything that she is not. It's small, it's sharp, it's commercial. And she says the comparison, it just seems too comical. And she actually goes on to say that it is rather like comparing one of Madame Tussauds waxworks heads to one of Woolner's ideal heroic busts. So as you can see here, here is Woolner making an ideal heroic bust of Tennyson. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a waxwork image of Tennyson, so Charles Dickens from Madame Tussauds will have to do. But it helps us to see what she's talking about, because the waxwork obviously has this, it has a kind of creepy, lifelike realism to it, but and a kind of literalness, as opposed to the idealized bust, which obviously makes reference to all sorts of art historic precedents. So Cameron further distinguishes herself from professional portrait photographers in a mocking account she gives in Annals of a Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse Donkins, who supposedly wrote to her to ask to have her portrait done. And she promises that as a carriage person, she would arrive with her dress uncrumpled. Okay, it's like a tongue twister, so I'm going to do my best here. She writes, Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins informs Mrs. Cameron that she wishes to sit for her photograph. Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins is a carriage person and therefore could assure Mrs. Cameron that she would arrive with her dress uncrumpled. Should Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins be satisfied with her picture, Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins has a friend, also a carriage person, who would also wish to have her likeness taken. So in Annals of My Glass House, Cameron quotes this entire letter, which I suspect she just made up. She claims that she received the letter from this person. And again, I'm showing another example of a carte visite, just as to imagine the type of photograph that Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins would hope to have taken, which again is the furthest thing that Cameron can imagine from the type of photograph that she would want to make. Oops. Oh, jumping ahead. Sorry. Oh no, that's fine. So she says, I answered Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins that Mrs. Cameron, not being a professional photographer, regretted that she was not able to take her likeness, but had Mrs. Cameron been able to do so, she would have very much preferred having her dress crumpled. So we see here a few examples, of which there are many, of how much Cameron embraced the crumpled dress. But also she actually says in Annals that she thought it was a kindness to reply to her correspondent, I'm not going to say the name again, and with a little art teaching. So in addition to crumpled drapery, another kind of recurring motif among Cameron's models are loose hair. She photographed many of her models with their hair loose, which surely would have been anathema to, one last time, Miss Lydia Louisa Summerhouse-Donkins. But these are two examples where I think she carried it most to extremes, where these masses of illuminated hair kind of become they dominate the composition so much they almost seem like they themselves, like the hair itself, is a separate living thing posing alongside the model. Cameron also distanced herself from convention by describing her passion for photography as so all-consuming that it eclipsed concerns for domestic propriety. She wrote that my husband, from first to last, has watched every picture with delight, and it's my daily habit to run to him with every glass upon which a fresh glory is newly stamped, and to listen to his enthusiastic applause. This habit of running into the dining room with my wet pictures has stained an immense quantity of table linen with nitrate of silver, indelible stains that I should have been banished from any less indulgent household. And she further disrupted the household by adapting parts of the property to her new photographic pursuit. She writes, I turned my coal house into my darkroom, and a glazed fowl house I had given to my children became my glass house. The society of hens and chickens was soon changed for that of poets, prophets, painters, and lovely maidens, who all in turn have immortalized the humble little farm erection. And the little humble farm erection is the building that we can see in the background there. And this is a very, was a very exciting find when I came across it in the V&A's collection. It's a whole nother story. We didn't realize we had it because it came in during World War II. But in any case, this is the only known photograph of this hen, what eventually became her glass house, as in Annals of My Glass House, her glass-roofed studio. And here it is when it was still a chicken coop. and you can see it in the background behind two of her maids pretending to draw water from the well behind her house, which is still there, and I have visited. But the glass house is no longer there. The well is still there. In any case, so this photograph is one of those bits of evidence we have for Cameron being involved in photography before she owned the camera, because we believe it was taken in the summer of 1863, and it's attributed to Oscar Gustav Rejlander, another very active and important photographer of that period. But it's, as we now, all of you can now recognize Cameron's handwriting also, and you can see that she inscribed the back of it herself, and she inscribed it to the Signor, which was her nickname for G.F. Watts, George Frederick Watts, who was an artist and very close friend of hers and an artistic mentor to her. So the two, so she talks about how the company of chickens was replaced by poets, prophets, painters, and lovely maidens. And so these two domestic workers of hers were among the lovely maidens who would soon be posing in the glass house in religious roles. And we see here Mary Ryan on the left, who would subsequently pose for many different roles, and you can see some of them in the exhibition, and Mary Kellaway is on the right. And so they're sort of acting out something that would have actually been part of their, may very well have been part of their daily tasks, but they're sort of posing, acting in the scene of drawing water from the well. And here we can see them, just the following year, taking up those roles. So here, I'll just describe it. In the far picture, the three Marys. So the one before we had two Marys, now we have three Marys. The one on the right is Mary Ryan, the one in the middle is Mary Kellaway, and then on the left is Mary Hillier. Mary Hillier was one of another member of Cameron's household staff, and she photographed her more than any other woman. And in fact, she played the role of the Madonna so often that supposedly people, friends of Cameron's, people in her circle, referred to her as Mary Madonna. And she actually, in addition to appearing as the Madonna, she actually appeared pretty much as every type of character that Cameron ever attempted, so including angel, saint, poet, and Shakespearean heroine, to name just a few. And Cameron often photographed her in bold profile, which Cameron described as being pure and perfect in outline. Her passage about her is worth quoting. "Another little maid of my own from early girlhood has been one of the most beautiful and constant of my models, and in every manner or form has her face been reproduced, yet never has it been felt that the grace of the fashion of it has perished. The very unusual attributes of her character and complexion of her mind, if I may so call it, deserve mention in due time, and are the wonder of those whose life is blended with ours as intimate friends of the house." So here, Cameron is kind of, just lost my space again. Yes, so I mean, you can see here that Cameron is both sort of being both sincere and also completely patronizing once again by praising Hillier's outer beauty as well as surprise her intelligence, but also remarking that is what makes her such a good model. But it seems to come as a surprise to Cameron and her friends that she has this kind of inner complexity of mind. So spanning the whole of her photographic career in England, Hillier did not go with the family when they left for Ceylon. Her studies of Hillier include some of the most radical experiments, as we've seen already, in lighting and composition and photographic process. And in the same passage, she talks about how this last autumn, her head, illustrating the exquisite Maud, is as pure and perfect in outline as were my Madonna studies 10 years ago, with 10 times added pathos to the expression. So finally, as I said, Cameron wrote Annals shortly before she left for Ceylon. And so because of that, the text doesn't offer any insights into the photographs that she made there. The few photographs that she did make in her final years there are in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways are consistent with her practice in England. They were apparently made in pursuit of beauty, and her subjects were mainly local people who she described in the patronizing terms of a colonial landowner. But they were also arranged in very familiar poses. So we can see here in these three photographs this motif of water bearing, which goes right back, as we've just seen, to the very beginning or even prehistory of Cameron's career as a photographer. So although unfinished, Annals represents a sort of narrative arc from uncertain beginnings to eventual success. Cameron characterizes her photographic practice as emerging from a domestic setting into a public one, complete with exhibitions and published reviews and international patronage. Always in pursuit of beauty, her emotional investment in her work remains strong, whether photographing close friends and family, domestic staff, or high-profile men such as Carlyle, Sir John Herschel, and Tennyson. Annals of My Glass House begins with the claim that, quote, Mrs. Cameron's photography, now 10 years old, has, quote, traveled over Europe, America, and Australia, and met with a welcome which has given it confidence and power. And thanks to the V&A's extensive holdings, Mrs. Cameron's photography continues to travel the world in exhibitions, such as this one here in Milwaukee. Now over 150 years old, the power of Mrs. Cameron's photography remains undiminished. Thank you.